Это презентация последнего номера журнала Stasis, который посвящен теме Terra, Natura, Materia по латыни, то есть земля, природа, материя. И сейчас скажу то же самое по-английски. Glad to welcome everyone for the launch of our recent issue. Very important issue of Stasis dedicated to Terra, Natura, Materia, Earth, Nature, and Matter. Several of the authors of the issue will kindly present the brief versions of their contribution. And now we will give some introductory words in Russian. So English speakers, please switch to the translation. You have such option. And the Russian audience will do the same if you don't understand English later. So forgive us for several introductory words in Russian first. Журнал Stasis, если вдруг кто-то не знает, это журнал, который мы издаем в Европейском университете в Санкт-Петербурге, журнал по философии и социальной теории, который вот сейчас выходит 9-й год, это 9-й том журнала. Мы представляем, это международный журнал, он публикует статьи по-английски и по-русски. Вот в этом номере в основном представлены статьи на английском языке, хотя не все. И журнал публикует, соответственно, как это принято, только оригинальные статьи с очень подробным и строгим peer review, которые авторы сегодняшние спикеры испытали на себе, я уверен, и их статьи стали еще замечательнее, чем были по прибытии в журнал. Я главный редактор журнала, я, собственно, просто рад вас всех приветствовать, я буду вести сегодняшнее мероприятие. Меня зовут Артемий Магун, как, собственно, написано в моем окошке. И я очень рад, что мы выпустили этот номер. Он был приурочен к открытию магистратуры по геофилософии. То есть вот эта тема Terra, Natura, Materia, она хорошо резюмирует вот слоганы нашей новой магистерской программы. Она успешно сейчас осуществляется первый год. Как раз вот все те вопросы, которые обсуждаются в журнале, стали темами ее основных курсов учебных. Скажу только, что действительно натурфилософия переживает новое рождение. Еще 20 лет назад, когда мы учились, казалось, что это какая-то устаревшая мистическая дисциплина, достояние каких-то фриков ненаучных. Сегодня, наоборот, как, собственно, и написано Оксаной в введении, она становится достоянием материалистов, то есть людей, которые, в принципе, мыслят трезво, стоят на твердой почве, укоренены в плотности вещей и в тягучем, так сказать, порядке существования. И в то же время вот они находят время и возможность поставить вопросы, которые продолжают вот эту романтическую рефлексию. И выясняется, что мистика была не мистикой, а вполне таким реалистическим описанием довольно странных процессов. Вот, и поэтому статьи в этом номере странные, кому-то может показаться. Используют прием остранения, описывают дикие вещи, потому что они про природу. И в то же время, как я уже сказал, это очень строгие научные статьи, прошедшие двойное слепое рецензирование. Так что мы отвечаем за их научность. На этой серьезной ноте я передаю слово, собственно, заместителю главного редактора Стасиса и редактору этого конкретного спецномера. Потом выступят, соответственно, авторы номера в порядке, в котором они представлены в журнале. И вот Артем Серебряков, присутствующий здесь, он демонстрирует иногда сам бумажный номер. Вот можете на него посмотреть. Но вообще журнал бесплатно доступен в интернете, поэтому те, кто забыл приобрести бумажную копию, могут смело читать онлайн-версию. Все, спасибо. Предоставляю слово Оксане.
Здравствуйте, Артем, спасибо большое за это представление и за вводные слова очень важные. Я рада видеть, очень рада, что у нас так много, несмотря на все трудные времена. Я безумно рада видеть некоторых авторов, кого-то из них я вижу в первый раз, поэтому это для нас еще и такое виртуальное знакомство. И рассказать об этом номере вдвойне приятно, так как это действительно плод нашего коллективного труда. Мы над ним работали, вложили туда все наше какое-то вдохновение, и номер получился пестрым, очень разнообразным. Когда где-то, наверное, год-полтора назад мы начинали работать, вернее, мы еще не... где-то, может быть, даже года 2 назад, я точно не помню, я всегда все путаю, все даты. В общем, вышел в какой-то момент номер дружественного нашего журнала «Логоса», который назывался «Темный логос», и он был посвящен темным антологиям, темным материям. И кто-то тогда пошутил, что, теперь, конечно, нужен нам светлый стасис. Мы как-то быстро про это забыли, однако же где-то, видимо, на каких-то задворках бессознательного у меня осталась эта мысль, это замечание, и я начала работу вот с такого солнечного блока. В какой-то момент, еще в самом начале, Имре Земан, наш коллега из Канады, неожиданно прислал нам манифест. Вернее, не манифест, но эссе, посвященное солярности, которое меня очень вдохновило. Я подумала, точно, про солнце. У нас будет вот такой вот светлый блок, в который я сама решила как-то подключиться и тоже написала туда статью. Но однако же он не столько светлый, сколько действительно такой пестрый, поскольку помимо вот этого солнечного такого микро, можно сказать, раздела, да, из 2 статей, может быть, он будет продолжен в следующем номере. Мы хотим поговорить об огне, еще каких-то таких вещах, феноменах, которые нас волнуют. У нас есть также 2 материала, посвященных Земле. Присутствующий здесь Майкл Мардер любезно предоставил нам удивительный текст, в котором новая философия Земли предлагается. Вообще текст, конечно, журнал, конечно, мы гордимся тем, что там вот есть несколько таких совершенно программных каких-то текстов, которые сами по себе являются начинанием. И вот текст Майкла из их числа, текст Имре Земана из их числа. Это что касается вот такого вот, таких вот вещей планеты, да, какие-то, или стихии, с которыми мы соприкасаемся. Но есть также, например, ряд статей, вот, например, Вадима Квачева или присутствующего здесь Бенджамина Норриса, которые связаны с теоретическим переосмыслением современных материалистических концепций. Они носят такой вот, ну, теоретико-методологический характер и связаны скорее с с такой переопределением научного инструментария в области того, что мы сегодня называем материализмом. Материализмом, как Артемий Владимирович правильно заметил, мы склонны, то есть мы называем самые разные вещи уже давно, но вот в последнее время материализмом и новым материализмом называется возвращающийся в каком-то своем преображенном виде в интеллектуальное поле современная философия природы или натурфилософия. Если раньше она такой была таким предприятием, как считалось, по крайней мере, как было написано в учебнике, предприятием таким скорее идеалистическим, то вот сейчас, да, сейчас философия природы называется материализм. Хотя, конечно, если копнуть глубже, и если вот всерьез начать заниматься философией природы, чем мы сейчас и занимаемся, в частности, на нашей программе в Европейском университете, программе по геофилософии, то можно заметить, что на самом деле то, что нам кажется архаичным, устаревшим и так далее, вот в традиционной философии, начиная там с греческой, с античной традиции, содержит в себе невероятный какой-то потенциал, который просто невозможно было вот раскрыть в то время. Тогда еще не было такой оптики, чтобы прочитать эти тексты тем способом, которым мы можем прочитать их сейчас. Вот такой вот основной посыл у нас, что на самом деле в истории философии уже содержится мощное рациональное зерно, в том числе и в натурфилософии, которое нужно оттуда вытаскивать, которое нужно реактуализировать. И я это называю таким, что ли, можно сказать, философским ресайклингом, когда мы какую-то вещь, которая кажется уже неиспользуемой, которая кажется уже принадлежит архиву историческому исключительно и отдана на откуп историкам философии, нужно эту вещь у них забрать, очистить, переделать, превратить ее во что-то, в мощное такое новое какое-то. Нет, оружие — это, конечно, неподходящее слово, нет, мы против всяких оружий, но в мощный какой-то мирный такой ресурс нам тоже не подходит, слова нет, это, конечно, никакой не ресурс. В общем, придумать подходящий термин, ну, в нашего какого-то...
Мирный атом, я предлагаю.
Точно, да, должен быть обязательно какой-нибудь элемент тут, причем мирный, да, участвовать. Ну, немножечко, может быть, я про свою статью пару слов скажу, дальше мы предоставим слово авторам. Но действительно, прежде всего, я вдохновлена была статьей Имры Земана, я прочитала его. Этот текст пришел в нашу редакцию первым, я его быстро прочитала, и тут меня осенило. Я подумала, да, действительно, надо что-то про солнце срочно такое написать. Я просто не могу в себе в этом отказать, в этой радости, в этом удовольствии. Но Имрет описал очень критический текст про то, что вообще вот эти вот современные наши теории, проекты, связанные с переходом на солнечную энергию, как такую более зеленую, более чистую, являются не такими уж безупречно прекрасными, и предлагает такую философскую критику этих экономических проектов, выдвигая тезис о том, что, ну, в частности, в том, что в рамках существующей системы социально-экономических отношений и распределения ресурсов, переход к использованию солнечной энергии совсем не сделает, ну, как и другие виды зеленого капитализма, в общем, не является таким уж прекрасным спасением для человечества. Однако я банализирую. На самом деле это, конечно, глубокий текст, который я вам советую прочесть. Я же хотела что-то написать такое в продолжении этого текста, однако тут случился коронавирус. И я не могла сосредоточиться на написании академической статьи, которую запланировала раньше, потому что весной 2020 года актуальность вот как-то давила и смешивала все карты. Я писала про Жоржа Батая, я хотела разобраться с тем, что такое солярная экономика, и что такое солярное насилие, что такое теория общей экономики, которую он предлагает в своей книге «Проклятая часть», а также в ряде других произведений. И тут до меня наконец-то дошло, что такое вообще насилие нечеловеческого, насилие солнцем. Я думала об изменении климата в этой связи, но также и о вирусах, о таком насилии, которое мы не можем воспринять как насилие, потому что нам кажется, что за насилием должен стоять какой-то насильник, человеческий, какой-то такой, с человеческим лицом. Насилие мы все время представляем себе с человеческим лицом. Может ли быть какое-то насилие нечеловеческого? Каким образом оно вписано в политическое? Какая его политика? Может ли у этого насилия быть апология? Я рассмотрела Батая в ряду других авторов, которые слева, в основном в левом таком спектре политическом, предлагали свои версии апологии насилия. Это Фанон, Сорель и Бенджамин. Те, кто писали такие в 20 веке, такие амбивалентные очень тексты о насилии. И Батая, но о насилии таком, знаете, вот о насилии угнетенных. Да, и Батая вот рассмотрела в этой кампании, сосредоточившись на современной ситуации, на пандемии, на том, как на нее реагируют мировые экономики, на том, как закрываются границы, как выстраиваются барьеры запретительные, и как мы все больше реагируем на всеобщую экономику, так сказать, природы, которая представляет собой, ну, что-то, что можно было бы назвать экологическим целым. Ответ со стороны мировых национальных государств, связанный со все большим выстраиванием вот таких вот ограниченных каких-то ограничений. То есть вот это вот сравнение ограниченной и неограниченной экономики, я попыталась рассмотреть его актуальный характер вот в связи с тем, что происходит. Но на этом я, наверное, закончу такую преамбулу о своем тексте и передам слово следующим нашим выступающим.
Спасибо большое, Оксана. Значит, сейчас будут выступать другие авторы номера. Прошу, нас много, поэтому прошу выступать коротко, 5-7 минут. Я думаю, что остальное люди прочитают, заинтересовавшись вашей рекламой. И пойду в порядке, в котором, собственно, статьи напечатаны. Так что предоставляю слово Вадиму Квачеву. Вадим, вы по-русски или по-английски будете говорить?
I can do both. Мы вроде как договаривались, что на английском языке.
Okay. So now we are switching to English. Vadim will present his contribution in English. So, дорогие товарищи и товарки, еще раз, если вы не очень хорошо понимаете по-английски, пожалуйста, включите у себя в Zoom функцию перевода. У нас сегодня есть синхронный перевод. Спасибо. Пожалуйста, Вадим.
Hello, everyone. And at first, I wanted to thank Stasis for this event, for this opportunity. to tell a little bit about my paper in the Stasis, but I try to be very short, which is, of course, very hard for us academics to do always. Okay, my article is devoted to what is called a flat ontology. The set of concepts which appeared from the 1990s till now, it's what I call a Baroque network of theories and ideas which are mixing Whitehead, Lovecraft, Latour, and other authors, but where we can find the two common signs of the principles they all more or less share. The first principle is that they are aimed at what they called idealism. Idealism, by idealism, they mean the reflection and search of the ideas as a part of the social reality. So they renounce the idealist dimension, and they call for concentrating on the pure, flat, materials, think, objects, not even objects, but the different entities which are not divided into the objects and subjects. The second thing, what might be called Anti-Anthropocentrism. The philosophy and social theory before was concentrating on a human as a general part around which the social philosophy is constructed. This set of theories, they are concentrated on the materialist world without distinction between nature and culture, object and subject, humans and non-humans. There are a lot of authors which can be attributed to these two ideas, but I am mostly concentrating on the three names: Latour, Graham Harman, and Manuel de Landa. And I try to outline what is common in these three authors' concept, and then I tried to criticize it from the point of view of the idea that what we call a flat ontology is a dimension that is in philosophy reflects the certain what we might call the practical concept in the social reality. Namely, if you look at this network of concept and how they present social reality, you might find a very similar thing in the economic theory, how economic theory and economics, practice of economy, use social reality. Flat, networked, and the subject to commodification, where everything is equalized, subject, object, and where there are no any hierarchical relations. Pierre Rozanvallon calls this economic ideology. Everything is exchange, everyone and everything is exchanged between each other, and the dimension of the idea, ideology, power, capital cannot be found because everything is flat. And I tried to criticize this concept with the practical case from our social economic reality. I tried to show the value chains. First, I tried to test it being presented as flat, where the value chain is in economy is a concept of the many actors which are produce all together the certain product. And I concentrated on the iPhone, trying to investigate how the iPhone is produced. And from the flat perspective, all the actors involved into this production value chain, from the worker in Africa, the mining worker, the factory worker in China, the entrepreneur, the knowledge worker in America, they are all equal because the flat dimension is presented as unhierarchical. But if we introduce the hierarchical dimension here, we can see that the flat ontology view actually hides the dimension of capital, the dimension of power, which is introduced in this outwardly visible flatness. So I tried to criticize this from this point of view and show that the theoretical framework that's most commonly used in the theories which can be described as flat, in most cases, they ignore the economic relations of power and capital introduced throughout the real economic practice of subjects. And I tried to show that this logic already existed, not in social philosophy, but in economics as a practice, because economics used to flatten social reality by equalizing everything, transforming every object and subject into exchange value, attributing price to everything. And the understanding of the classic economics of value creation process was always peaceful and unantagonistic. But if we look at the reality, at the social reality of production of things, especially in global value chains, we actually see the conflicts, the hierarchies, the power that's shaping this reality. So this is pretty much the description of the research I made under the paper, and I hope I wasn't taking too much time. Thank you very much.
No, perfect timing, Vadim. Thank you. And I forgot to mention that we actually continue with this topic. And Stasis published a second call for paper with the same subject. We are so overwhelmed with concerns and materials related to philosophy of nature that there will be a second issue of Stasis on this soon. We are already receiving many contributions. And speaking of this, we will have a new call for papers soon. And I encourage everyone to submit. Our second issue of 2021 will be devoted to feminism and psychoanalysis. We are working on the call for papers now, so in case you're interested. Феминизм и психоанализ. Начинайте думать и скоро присылайте нам статьи. Our next speaker is Майкл Мардер, who is professor of the University of Basque Country, residing in Portugal, and of course our co-editor in Stasis. Michael, you're welcome.
Спасибо большое, Артем, за приглашение. Я буду говорить по-английски, потому что сам текст написан по-английски, но просто хотел вот сказать, что очень рад быть в такой компании друзей, коллег и людей, которых я не очень знаю тоже. Вот, но нас сплотил вот этот вот специальный выпуск Стасиса. I will be speaking in English about my text, which is the language in which I wrote it, and I'm not going to give a kind of panoramic overview of it. Rather, I want to concentrate on a particular dimension of my article, the part where I argue that the Earth has never been itself. In other words, I want to show that there is a certain non-identity residing in the notion of the Earth, and that this non-identity is complex. It is not a simple non-identity, it is a complex one, and it has at least two distinct poles. On the one hand, the Earth traditionally has stood for the fathomless dimension of depth, of mystery, dense and impenetrable, that thanks to this basic resistance to understanding, to sense, could bear and support all Earthlings on its surface, allowing them to reproduce, to spring from its womb and to decompose, to come back to and melt into it. And that dimension was particularly illuminated by, or at least got in touch with by myth and mythical thinking. On the other hand, the Earth was reduced to a collection of natural resources, fertile soils, construction materials, territories to be occupied. And it was, in other words, it was withholding and always holding something in store for us, with these two moments tethered to one another in such a way that it turned out not to hold anything at all, anything other than a disaster in store, once it no longer withheld itself from the objectifying grasp. Once this kind of fragile balance between the impenetrable and the fathomless was disrupted, and there was a kind of an extreme emphasis on this resourcification, objectification of the Earth, it turned out that it could not, once it no longer withheld anything, it could no longer be also, I'm sorry, there's my son right here, and he will just wait for a moment. Yes. So the Earth, once it no longer held, it was no longer a part of this mysterious, impenetrable kind of mystical dimension. It could no longer support anything once it was simply reduced to a collection of raw materials or resources. And I would argue that whatever could be the shape of a future philosophy of the Earth or geophilosophy, one of my arguments is that we don't have and have never had a philosophy of the Earth yet. Whatever shape it could assume, it would have to develop it between these two dimensions of the mysterious and impenetrable and the completely objectifiable. So I foresee something like the emergence of an Earth self-consciousness, its self-relatedness, as a response to the idea that the Earth is yet to become articulating and articulated, that is self-articulating. If we state this formulaically, self-consciousness is a subset of self-articulation, which for its part is an aspect of self-relationality. And my paper is very much influenced by the work of Hegel, who actually assigns different kind of works or different analytical exercises to these different notions. So in the dialectical scheme of things, this division would correspond to Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, which deals, of course, with self-consciousness. The two logics that are concerned with the self-articulations of becoming as the mediated self-negation of pure being and nothing, and the philosophy of nature preoccupied with self-relations. And I want to actually put all of these levels together in this new philosophy of the Earth that would not divide them into the philosophy of spirit, logic, and philosophy of nature, but would allow the Earth to become a subject and an object of philosophy in a sense. In itself, the Hegelian Earth can never be itself, as it occupies a conceptual space of sheer positivity, in Hegel's work, of sheer positivity, the precondition for all positedness, which is not negated enough and therefore not internally mediated with the other. So it's worth quoting very briefly from Hegel's philosophy of nature, where he says, the Earth is initially the abstract ground of individuality, which posits itself in its process as the negative unity of the abstract mutually separating elements, end quote. While not as neutral as light, its abstractness parallels the logical category of pure being that has no history, no temporality, until it is negated by and negates nothingness. But I think that another interpretation of the Earth's non-identity is also possible, and it is also colored with dialectical hues, namely that there is a surplus, not a negativity, but a surplus of what is not Earth constituting the Earth. And I mean by this simply the earthly fold that encompasses not only the soil, but also the atmosphere, the sea, solar light and heat, that is to say, all of the elements in the planet itself. And that is also the non-identity of the Earth in its more kind of exuberant, positive, even over positive aspect. The Earth is the only element that, negating itself, receives all other elements in itself, which is why, in Hegel's terms, consequently, it is the real ground and actuality of individualization. It is this capacity, this capaciousness of the earth to negate itself and to receive all the other elements in itself. Of course, fire was mentioned already. Oksana talked a little bit about fire, and fire does this as well. It receives all things by negating them and only incidentally itself, right? So with fire, the direction of negation or the emphasis of negation is different from that of the earth. Fire first negates the other and only incidentally itself when it burns out, when it destroys the material substratum in which it burns and consumes the oxygen necessary for its activity. So I want to focus on this positivity, this surplus, this more of the earth, which is actually always presented as less, as something lesser in metaphysical thought that seeks the true source of and the final reference for meaning elsewhere than in the finite sphere, delimited whether symbolically or not by the terrestrial horizons. And so according to this perspective, the ontological foundations of the world are neither in the world nor on earth, but behind the world or above the earth, for instance, in heavens or in the sky, as Marx puts it in his critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. So I will skip over some more of the more technical details, and to conclude, I would like to think very briefly about this geological designation, the Anthropocene, the presumably new geological era that the Earth has entered with human traces, the traces of human activities imprinted on it. What the geological designation of the Anthropocene means, at least nominally, is that the world of capitalist technoscience has become the gate crusher of the earth. So this distinction world earth that Heidegger works with, for instance, no longer applies. The world of capitalist technoscience has become the gate crusher of the earth. Far from a synthesis of the two, it transposes distorted ideological metaphysical images onto the earth's actuality, insinuating them into geological crusts in the shape of the residues and debris of agricultural and industrial activities. It is, I think, a moot point to ask what would have happened were Europe not to have attained its position of colonial world dominance as a precursor to capitalist modernity. Were our species never to have had its evolutionary success, or were it to disappear from the face of the planet? Metaphysics and the ideologies it feeds into in the vast majority of world religions see the earth representing finite existence as a whole, either as a trash bin or as trash itself, worth throwing away on a quest for true being. So returning now to the earth and trying to revive, or maybe to imagine for the first time ever, a philosophy of the earth, we are going back to something like that has been considered as garbage, literally, for a long time. The rise of agriculture, the Industrial Revolution, and the aftermath of these earth-shattering events in world history have done no more than give body to that devastating idea. Nor will the extinction of Homo sapiens sapiens amount to a significant change after the elements themselves, the soil, the sea, the atmosphere, have been altered, impregnated with plastics and various forms of carbon emissions. The ideal of the earth without us is one of the most recent manufactured molds of metaphysics, laced with a large dose of nihilism. So this is not the philosophy of the earth, obviously, I'm aiming at, this nihilistic earth without us that would be a peaceful ideal without human interference, but rather I want to imagine an earth that would be self-articulating. And to do so, in order not to idealize the self-articulation, we would need to get our hands dirty, really, and to get to something that was philosophically, traditionally considered to be no more than garbage, something worth throwing away, or at best using as a conjunction of useful resources. Thank you so much for your attention.
But one immediate note is that there is this demonic potential in the earth that many of the authors note. And that's precisely the potential with which technology works. Michael and I just wrote an article on it, which is published in our friend journal, Crisis and Critique, on gas and blast. So one of the issues for the discussion is how we can, well, basically establish a friendly relationship with this demonic element, to return to the not so negative meaning of the demonic that used to be the meaning, and now demonic is, of course, viruses and other enemies of humanity. So without further ado, I pass the floor to Ben Norris from the University of Berkeley.
There we go. Hi, everybody.
Correct.
Yeah, that's me. Yeah, I just finished up a visiting researcher position at University of Berkeley. So first off, I'd really like to thank, obviously, the editors and my readers, my anonymous readers. They offered some great comments and I think really improved the article. So basically the framing is, I've been really interested in this figure Jacobi for a long time. And one of the things that I try to do is take Jacobi at his own word. And that is to read him as a realist and not the kind of irrationalist figure that he's often portrayed as in the sort of brief mentions that we get to him in the history of philosophy. So with that in mind, I'm just going to sort of read some brief sections from my paper to give you an idea of the argument that I'm working with. So instead of a brand new response to a novel philosophical problem, new realism is a repetition of Friedrich Heinrich Jacobi's criticism of philosophical rationality that ignited what is now known as the pantheism controversy in German academia at the close of the 18th century. My contribution to this edition of Stasis assembles an argument for this being the case by looking at the intertwining of philosophical and social issues expressed by both Jacobi and the new realist Mauricio Ferraris. Both Jacobi and Ferraris argue that anti-realist epistemologies displace our relation to the world to which thought is supposed to be beholden. By inverting this relation between mind and world, we become convinced that reality actually is as we construct it to be. As Jacobi argues, we take ourselves to be gods, capable of creating worlds through thought alone. This assumption is nothing short of madness, and it is this madness that Jacobi fears more than anything else. This fear of madness, this dementophobia, is shared by Ferraris. It is not just this phobia that Ferraris shares with Jacobi. Both Jacobi and Ferraris claim that the antidote to these delusional philosophical ideations is realism. Further, their respective characterizations of the real reveal that both take a reactionary stance towards the renegotiation of authority that stands at the core of the Enlightenment project. If this is the case, then new realism is a repetition and not an advance. So further, it is a fundamentally anti-Enlightenment philosophical development and pre-Kantian in the worst of possible ways. So this is in and of itself perhaps not a problem. Many philosophical developments secure a lineage in the history of philosophy regardless of conscious or unconscious influence. Further, many philosophies claim to be anti or post-Enlightenment. Why then bring new realism into conversation with Jacobi's self-proclaimed non-philosophy of non-knowledge? What Jacobi adds to the analysis provided by new realism is that the crisis being experienced by philosophy in relation to the real is not a contingent historical product. It is instead a crisis at the core of philosophy itself. In other words, from the new realist perspective, the anti-realist commitments of contemporary philosophy are the product of a series of errors, whereas for Jacobi, the anti-realist insufficiency of philosophy is a product of philosophy's own essence. So if it is the case that coherentism cannot fulfill philosophy's desires, then we must confront anti-realism as the essence of philosophy and not a contingent historical outcome in order to orient ourselves beyond what Jacobi identified as nihilism. So the overall goal of this comparison is to argue for a return to the post-Kantian speculative philosophies of the absolute in response to re-emerging problems in naturalist and realist philosophy. So it is this return to the post-Kantians that can bypass the naivete and misplaced novelty of new realism. Jacobi and Ferraris articulate distinguishable notions of realism, but there is at bottom a characteristic that they both share, and this characteristic determines their respective realisms as fundamentally reactionary and counter to the spirit of the Enlightenment. So in general, I follow Foucault's minimalist definition of Enlightenment as a modification of the pre-existing relation linking will, authority, and the use of reason, end quote. So Enlightenment is not reducible to a particular historical period, a set of thinkers, or even a unified set of commitments. The Enlightenment project is instead an ongoing act of renegotiating existing configurations of will, reason, and authority. What Jacobi explicitly and Ferraris implicitly reject is the idea that the relation between will, reason, and authority is modifiable. So this is evidenced most clearly by the role that passivity plays in relation to the real ground of truth for both thinkers. For both, if reason and will recognize them or reorganize themselves in order to take an active stance towards the constitution of authority, then reality in turn slips into nothingness. So the point I'm seeking to establish is not that either reason or will are in themselves an absolute authority, but instead that reason and will must play both an active and a passive role in the practices of conceptual constitution and determination in response to certain constraints. So to limit will and reason to vehicles of passive reception of constraint robs each of its reformatting potential. So when the constraint of the real is premised upon passive relation to authority, authority is essentially rendered transcendent. And in this case, we're talking about the authority of what they broadly call the real. So despite the 2 centuries separating contemporary philosophy from the writings of Jacobi, the fear of a lost world persists. The fear of the madness of idealism returns. So we are warned against a one-sided criticism, but we are in turn forced back into a one-sided dogmatism. At bottom, for both Jacobi and Ferraris, the function of conceptuality must take the real as an external, transcendent, and therefore inscrutable authority, to which one must assume a position of absolute passivity. Thus, if the pantheism controversy was a working through of the relation between the scope of rationality and the traditional limits of authority, Ferraris finds himself squarely on the reactionary counter-enlightenment side of Jacobi, ultimately safeguarding the transcendence of authority from the developments in natural and social sciences. Further, this particular philosophical problematic regarding the inscrutability of transcendent authority has always carried with it extra philosophical concerns regarding the decimation of the very fabric of sociality. So when reason and will take aim at the authority of transcendence, a reactionary backlash occurs. Any modification of the relations between will, reason, and authority, right, which is, as Foucault and I would agree, constitutes the very function of enlightenment. This always elicits a counter-reaction to this renegotiation. So the counter-reaction in turn is grounded in the faulty assumption that any attempt to renegotiate the complex triadic relation of reason, will, and authority leads only to madness. So it is this persistent fear that's passed down through generations. What Ferraris helps make clear is that Jacobi's dilemma remains our own. Jacobi's fear that Spinozism and transcendental idealism lead to nihilism has been transmuted into the new realist fear that postmodernism has yielded a similar brand of nihilism in which finite subjectivity is conflated with divinity. Put otherwise, for both Jacobi and Ferraris, the faulty inflation of the mind's determinative capacities has exiled any relevant determinative capacities of the world. The world no longer constitutes the structures of the mind and thought. It is instead mind and thought that have come to constitute the world in what Quentin Meillassoux has characterized as Kant's Ptolemaic counter-revolution. So both Jacobi and Ferraris maintain that that the only way to know the real is to assume a fundamental passivity in relationship to the authority of an absolute externality. Both argue that it is only through a rationally inscrutable anti-conceptual form of access, which Jacobi calls faith and which Ferraris calls experience, can we find meaning and truth. So meaning and truth are absolutely received, and this reifies an absolute division between subject and object. So the problem here is not the idea of passive reception or external constraint as such. The problem is instead the absolutization of passivity, which in turn forestalls the functioning of reason. So I want to conclude by insisting that this analysis is not to be taken as a criticism of the return to realism or even of the speculative realists more generally. In the end, I do believe that Ferraris's error, the misplaced novelty of the project of new realism, overshadows the insights therein. So the contextualization of Ferraris's new realism in the anti-enlightenment tradition of Jacobi provides is a clarification of the realist insight and an indication of a path forward for speculative philosophy. Ferraris believes himself to be setting a high bar for new realism when he writes the following, quote, "We should try instead a maximalist commitment that could be called speculative along the lines of Anglo-French speculative realism because it shares the ambition of the great speculative systems of the idealistic age, that is to philosophically account for the integration between science and common sense," end quote. So this aspiration is ultimately modest, and I believe disappointingly so. The reconciliation of science and common sense and speculative philosophy is a consequence of a much broader philosophical aspiration. Meillassoux exposes the core of speculative realism when he argues for an expansion of the reaches of thought in order to face the task of once again renegotiating the relationship between philosophical rationality and the authority of the real. So in fact, the entire purpose of the controversial argument of the arche-fossil and ancestrality is to enjoin us to, quote, reconcile thought and the absolute. These are the closing lines of After Finitude. So this is precisely the task undertaken by Hegel and Schelling, and it is one that must be remembered and worked through instead of denigrated and cast aside. In other words, we must recognize New Realism's hasty goodbye to Kant as necessitating a hello to post-Kantian idealism and the beckoning of the absolute. Thank you so much for listening to me.
This was very interesting. Thank you. And I think there are obvious rhymes here between what Michael and Ben said.
Yeah,
so
that's what I
maybe
was
you
thinking
can
as well.
comment on each other. Now, unfortunately, at least for some time, I need to go. So Oksana will chair the discussion. Now you're welcome to comment. The audience is in. And I say goodbye. Maybe I'll be back.
Goodbye. So we don't have more speakers, right?
Right.
We can go for, let's open the
Moderate the
discussion then. Any comments, immediate questions? You can also write in chat or raise your hand, maybe, if someone is having questions, comments. If not yet, I will probably address to Michael with a short comment about Hegel's, as we touched Hegel, about his other elements. As far as I know, the earth and the fire are not the only ones that negate themselves. Also water, and water does negate themselves. So each element negates itself, but they make it differently. What the water does is a sacrifice, as he writes in the Phenomenology of Spirit, at least. So water sacrifices itself. And this is actually in phenomenology. This is one of his weirdest, maybe, fragments, where he addresses the four elements, the dialectics of the four elements, with regards to the development of the Western pre-revolutionary intelligence, and it's what he calls a noble consciousness, and its transformations, how it passes from servility to freedom. So this dialectics is inscribed. The dialectics of the elements is inscribed within this history of a certain kind of consciousness, and the notion of sacrifice is really interesting here. It looks like marginal, but actually a reader can understand that Hegel means something really fundamental. And I know, Michael, that you developed the theory of, you have your own take on the theory of sacrifice in Parapolitics and other writings. Can you please, can you maybe reflect a little bit upon the earth and sacrifice? Yeah, if there are some comments on this.
Yes, sure, Oksana. Thank you so much for these thought-provoking questions. I completely agree with you that in Hegel, all the four elements are self-negating, but they each negate themselves in a peculiar way. And the earth and fire particularly are situated at the opposite extremes from one another. in a kind of hierarchy that Hegel builds from the most material to the most ideal. So in the end, while fire is one of the material elements, it is already touching upon ideality because it destroys the materiality of other bodies. Destroys, but also preserves by embracing them, by incorporating the bodies that burn in itself. So first, we will talk a little bit more about the fire, if you'd like, fire and sacrifice. But first of all, the earth as the most kind of material of the elements is probably for Hegel the least self-negated. That's why he says it is the ground of absolute positivity upon which everything is to be founded. Its negation, in a sense, for Hegel is going to be necessarily incomplete, necessarily very immature in a sense, in that way. And I hinted in my very brief remarks at the opposite senses in which the earth and fire are self-negated. So the earth, by negating itself, opens up the space for the existence of everything else, all the other elements and living beings that it supports and carries. It is initially self-negating and then embracing others. With fire, it's the exact opposite. Fire negates its others and only subsequently is self-negating when the substratum in which it burns is no longer enough for the fire to keep burning, or when there's not enough oxygen anymore in the atmosphere to provide it with a fuel with another fuel for burning. Yes, I can see that Oksana has the fire right there. So they are the extreme ends of one another. Because of that, not only in Hegel, but also in ancient Greece already, fire is associated with a kind of impersonal or depersonalized elemental thinking. Fire is a kind of thinking force. That's why the Greeks have this term pyrphroniminon, discerning fire. Fire is a kind of discernment, a way of intellection, of understanding things, because each thing burns differently. So in this different negation of each thing that burns, fire is analyzing, is understanding beings negatively, dialectically in that way. And I think Hegel is very much aware of this Greek kind of perception and this playing with it dialectically. Another thinker in the German Romanticist tradition who is very aware of this is, of course, Novalis, for whom fire is this mind of nature, the mind in nature, decoupled from human intellection, from a human mind. And Novalis says something like, for our thinking, everything is a problem to be analyzed. And for fire, every being is a problem to be analyzed. And in being burnt, those things are being thought through by the fire that burns in them. So that's in terms of this kind of non-human, other than human intellection in the elements. But what I was trying to do in this particular essay is to give the earth its own self-consciousness, because Hegel is willing to give fire its self-consciousness because it is the force of the most refined material negativity that already touches on the ideal. But I want to go back to the earth and think of it also as a self-conscious being, and then maybe develop this, what we are trying to term geophilosophy in tandem with this kind of rethinking of the earth. If you're interested, we can talk more about fire or other issues related to this. So yeah.
Yes, I can say that I think this is absolutely fantastic. And yeah, now I pass, we will talk later about that, but now Benjamin has a question for Vadim. Benjamin, sorry.
Yeah, hi. I had a quick question about your critique, because from my understanding, or at least the way I read it, right, so explicitly in Harman, maybe a little bit less so in Natura, but also for the sort of new realists that I was discussing as well, the idea of the flat ontology, it's a claim about ontological equality, right? Whereas it sounds like your criticism has to do with, as you put it, the sort of asymmetry in power relations or, right, social place, economic place, this kind of stuff that happens within the particular production chain that you look at, right? But that doesn't imply an ontological inequality or something like that. So I'm wondering if that kind of criticism almost misses a little bit of what the new realists are trying to get across, right? Which is just the basic claim that all things that exist equally.
Okay, Benjamin, thank you for your question. I am critical in this way, referring to the what might be called the idea of the reproducing of the reproducing the flat intellectual movement in the form of the social reality itself. And here I generally based on the I can give an example of my logic based on the famous work of the Alfred Sohn Rettel, Intellectual and Manual Labor of the 1978, where he claims that his claim is about the science, the abstract thinking in science. And he claims that the commodity form, as it was put in Marxist analysis, itself precedes the form of thinking in the capitalist society. The abstract reasoning is possible, according to Sohn Rettel, only because the real abstraction was already in place, was realized by the commodity form in the market capitalism. So, which means that the pragmatic turn, the pragmatic stance was preceding the abstract thinking as we know it in the modern times. The social reality makes the certain symbolic order possible. And this is how the ideology rooted in social practice, not like in the idealism, like the domain of the, like the old-fashioned idealism, the domain of the ideas which exist somewhere above the reality, but the idealism in practice that is exists within social reality. So what I tried to put there in my paper, that it's very peculiar that many of the I claim that the it's very interesting that the predecessor of the philosophy of flat ontology was exactly in the revival of the sociology by the Latour and the works of the sociologist of the STS, when they tried to return the sociology back into the science from after the postmodern turn. They tried to do a turn to things, a pragmatic turn. So they tried to prove that pragmatically sociology still alive, it can describe the reality even after the meta-narratives, they were abandoned, they were criticized by postmodernism. And my idea basic, I don't know if I can describe this very clearly now, is to show how these structures of reasoning are isomorphic in the economic reasoning, I mean the scientific economic reasoning, and which was not clearly touched in the paper, but which interesting me a lot in the day-to-day regular life economic reasoning, in the sociological reasoning, and now what we have in the philosophy here. I'm not sure if I answered your question. I tried to clarify this.
Right, yeah, so the question has to do with, so I think I understand the isomorphism that you want to establish, but it doesn't necessarily follow that the claims in sociology are ontological claims, right? The claim of a flat ontology is an ontological claim, right? It's a claim about existence. So even in this sort of sociological model, I'm not necessarily sure if the concern is there in the same way, right? Again, the basic claim of someone like Graham Harman is that all things are objects, all objects exist equally, right? Period, full stop. That's the kind of basic level claim there. So I'm not positive if bringing in the sociological discourse actually disputes that ontological point. Like I think you're pointing towards a really important sort of shortcoming in the flat ontology or the new realist theories, right? But I just, from the perspective, if I was coming at this as a new realist, I feel like that would be the sort of criticism I would bring back. So I'm not convinced that you sort of get at the core of what the project was trying to do, which was, again, just to, right, establish ontological equality between all things that exist. But yeah, thank you for the response. It's really, really interesting.
Thank you. And I partly agree with you because exactly in my paper, the target wasn't the ontological. I agree here. And it is clear from reading the paper that my target was the socio-economic level, the level of the pragmatism. Maybe it's not enough. Here I agree with you, because of course all we academics know that each attempt to write a paper to describe all your thoughts is always in certain way fail, more or less fail. Maybe this is the future aim, the future target. So I partly agree with you, actually. Thank you for the question and for your...
Yeah, thank you for the response. That makes a lot of sense.
Julie Reshe raised her hand. She's our guest from Siberia. I kindly ask participants to introduce themselves when you ask questions, like where are you from, something like this. Yeah.
Thank you, Oksana. Well, I was introduced already. So I want to ask Michael, thank you for the presentations. And about the self-consciousness, maybe it's a quite weird question, because I was thinking about self-consciousness of nature more in Hegelian way, not in Hegelian, maybe in the opposite way, because for Hegel, it's a negation, and we go through to the synthesis through the symbolic level. So in nature, it's easy to find, it's easy to fight here with Hegel, because what he claims that we need the human consciousness, we need the symbolic level for this. Well, in nature, there is already this symbolic level which makes human not so unique. Like, this is why we can quote biology, the object of biology is DNA. So there is the language that it's not human language, but it's still language, and human just have a different language. But how it, if you talk about Earth, so what about the symbolic level? So for me, I don't agree with Magun. I hope he is not here, about the daimonic is not negative. For me, it's negative all the way. It's always negative. It don't have to go through this synthesis into something even more positive than it was positive before. So what do you think about the symbolic self-consciousness of Earth and symbolic level? Thank you.
Yes, that's a wonderful question, and of course it goes not only to the issue of the self-consciousness of the Earth, but also to other hot topic issues in contemporary philosophy, such as the language of plants. In what sense can we talk about the language of plants if obviously we are not taking language at the symbolic level here, but as a kind of basic self-expression of the living, for instance, as one a level of what language means. So just to give a background to this, what I was trying to do very briefly in these remarks is to say that Hegel reserves different designations for what generically may be called self-relationality, for different adventures of spirit in the world. So at the level of phenomenology, he obviously speaks about self-consciousness, but he does not refer to self-consciousness when he talks about philosophy of nature, for instance, or in the logics, right? There, we can think about self-relationality precisely, or self-articulation. And so obviously for Hegel, there is something very specific that defines consciousness. It is not necessarily human as a biological species, but this capacity for self-negation, the experience precisely as an existential self-negation through the experience of death. This kind of negativity. This is where self-consciousness and language and so on arise from. So I think that given the kind of indeterminacy, the radical indeterminacy of the meaning of the earth that I'm operating with in this paper, the earth has never been one, which means that its meanings are radically open, are multiple, and are not reducible to one true meaning. What I'm saying is that even this very specific Hegelian understanding of self-consciousness as a negation through the anticipation of finitude or through the thought of finitude, precisely now at the time of an extreme ecological crisis, this can be transferred onto the level of the earth as a whole, but understood not as a whole, as a planet or as the soil or as the fold of the living, but across all of these different ways of understanding the earth, we can finally start contemplating the idea of self-consciousness, even in a more strictly Hegelian way, in relation to the earth, as a kind of an anticipation of death, of being toward death or being shaken by death, as it were, in relation to finitude. So all I wanted to do is somehow to gather these different levels of relating to oneself in Hegel, and say that all of them apply to the earth, not just self-relationality and self-articulation, but also self-consciousness in that sense. Yeah. Sorry, and of course the symbolic domain that you outline, for me, at least in my reading of Hegel, it is absolutely an outcome. It's a necessary outcome of the relation to death, of the thought of death. So the symbolic domain does not have any special significance aside from being this consequence or an offshoot of the thought of mortality. Yeah.
Thank you. It's also dying, like the very process of what we call life. Thank you.
Any more questions? If not, Anton is having a question, but before I will give a word to Anton, I will just contribute a little bit to your discussion, again from my reading of the phenomenology of spirit, which I read for the last 5 years. Therefore, everything always is trying to say from myself about this book, where Hegel calls Earth a universal individuum. And by this, he means an embodied contradiction between an individual and a universal. You have something that is so universal, it really applies to all, to everything. It's like the earth is like everything, really. But at the same time, it is also something. Something that you can smell, that you can touch. So it's not like an apeiron in Greek, because it's not an abstract something. It is concrete, and but also another thing from chapter 5 of the phenomenology, just to mention. To reply Julie, who mentioned DNA, I have to say that there is an interesting moment where Hegel discusses the essence of a living organism. What is a living organism? and mentions that the essence of it is that an organic being is something that negates itself, that has a principle of negation within itself. And finally, he somehow gets to an idea that this principle, that this innermost self of a living being is a number. This is a strange, fragment, but just to think of it, I have no other ideas. What should be this kind of number than what we now call DNA? I don't know. Just a funny comment. But now Anton wants to say something.
Yes. I have a question to Benjamin. First, thanks to the paper. Beautiful reading of Jacobi, and with identifying Jacobi and Maurizio Ferraris, it's also very interesting, and I can only agree with this. But I have some question about relationship between German idealism and speculative realism, which you mentioned. I think that actually there are two major lines of speculative realism. Okay, something like flat ontology, Vadim said about this a lot today, and neo-rationalism, Brassier, Negrestani, and other thinkers of this kind. So I think that flat ontology is quite close to Spinoza and dogmatism, but in very pluralist and stable fashion. And neo-rationalist is close to Fichteanism, but in Kieber way, technological Kieber way, yeah. So my question, how we can save this very important turn to absolute without collapsing in Spinozism or Fichteanism? Or in other words, how we can repeat Schelling and Hegel today?
Mm-hmm.
What is your thought about this?
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for the question. This gives me an opportunity to really talk about something else that I've been working on. So I've been working on a book that centers around Schelling's critique of Spinoza. And if you're familiar with some of the stuff that goes on there, particularly in some of the letters that he writes and the writings around between 1800 and 1804, I think that Schelling really takes up Jacobi's claim that Fichteanism is an inverted Spinozism, right? He's got this line that the only way I was able to find my way into Fichtean philosophy was through Spinoza, right? And I think that if you read Schelling, one of the things that he does when he's criticizing the sort of mutually exclusive doctrines of realism and idealism is he's juxtaposing what he sees as this kind of one-sided idealism in Fichte to this one-sided realism that he sees in Spinoza. So that's kind of where I'm like, I think that your characterization is really interesting. I would agree in general with the sort of claim about flat ontology in relationship to Spinoza. I think that Negarestani in particular is working with a certain reading of Hegelianism against a kind of Fichteanism, right? So, or at least trying to posit a kind of objective idealism as opposed to a sort of more subjective idealism, if we like those terms in the first place. But yeah, so that's kind of the idea there, is reading Schelling is trying to articulate a criticism of basically the role that monism plays in both idealism and realism as articulated by Fichte and Spinoza respectively, right? So if we look at the 1795 Letters on Criticism and Dogmatism, one of the major problems there that he comes across is this idea that all existence is subsumed either in the subject or in the object, right? And I think the common theme there, and this is where it relates back to my paper, is this idea of internality and externality, right? Or immanence and transcendence. And both of those categories presuppose the existence of a unified ontological register. And what I want to do is argue that in his criticism of Spinoza, Schelling actually shows that we necessarily have to push past that as an ontological, metaphysical, epistemological construct, right? This idea of a unified monistic register. And in doing so, he kind of breaks this deadlock between realism and idealism and immanence and transcendence, right? So none of those categories fully make sense to capture the project that he's at least signaling towards, right? And then this connects back to my sort of final comments on Maya Su about the idea of the project of speculative realism more generally, of pushing past the finitude of thinking, right? Pushing past a notion of consciousness, self-consciousness, rationality, all of these kind of things that are dependent upon some kind of notion or constraint of finitude, right? I think that when Schelling, particularly in the identity philosophy, is writing about reason and the sort of totality of reason and rationality, what he's doing there is he's saying that the philosopher is actually situated within this much larger practice, right? So the philosopher may understand themselves as finite through the perspective of understanding, but once they begin thinking philosophically, they are no longer finite in that same way, right? They're a local instantiation of the process of absolute self-understanding. And by that, I mean the absolute coming to understand itself. So that's kind of where I see a major break between a reading of Schelling in this light and then a reading of Hegel in this light, which comes back to some of the comments that Michael was making earlier. But yeah, that would be my kind of general response. Does that kind of get at the question you were asking?
Yes, of course. I can clarify my point. I think that Negristani's Hegelianism is a Hegelianism without nature philosophy. So it's very close to subjective idealism of Fichte from my perspective, but I see your point. And also I have another question. Your reading of Schelling is concerned with the early Schelling, with Schelling of letters about dogmatism and criticism, yes?
Basically, what the book I'm writing looks at from about 1795 until 1810, right? So, and it focuses on particular, so, you know, Schelling makes this comment that the 1904 philosophy of religion is basically a prefiguration of the freedom essay, right? Which then I actually think is more formally systematized in the 1810 Stuttgart seminars. So, I mean, it gets sort of down into nitty gritty Schelling nerdy stuff. But yeah, so it's concerned with that period. It cuts off right before the Weltalter stuff. But I believe the reading that I provide of Schelling's critique of Spinoza holds true throughout those texts as well.
Yeah, I understand. Thanks.
Any more questions or comments?
Right, sorry, and just real quick to respond to the part about Negarestani, I think that, I think that the problem there is not necessarily that it's implicitly anti-naturalist, but I think that the sort of Schellingian critique of this idea in maybe Kant, Spinoza, right, maybe even Hegel, of the idea that there is no natural history or there is no nature or there is no history of nature. I think that that applies to Negarestani, and that's where this kind of anti-naturalism might creep in after the fact. You know, so in the chapters on intelligence and spirit, when he's trying to talk about conceptualizing human consciousness in terms of the fact that we are predatory beings, right? And how that ought to color our understanding of the way that humans interact with the world, right? That's not an anti-naturalist point, but at the same point in time, I think that when you deny the existence of natural history, then this kind of anti-naturalism can be smuggled in perhaps through the back door. So that would be my, so I kind of agree with you and I kind of disagree with you there, I guess. But yeah, thank you for the question.
Okay, Vadim is leaving. We say goodbye and thank you for being a part of this presentation. And we check if there are any more comments or questions. If not, I will probably take some more of your time and refer to one. Oh, okay.
I will
you can write it in the chat if the connection is not very good, Artemi, or try again. We didn't hear you. Oh, or did you? Am I the only one who didn't hear Artemi? No, I'm not the only one. Artemi, do you hear us?
No, you can. Well.
The connection was a little bit bad, but we are waiting for Артемий. Meanwhile,
Maybe now, can you hear me?
yes, yes.
Very briefly, I will speak before the connection is lost. The political implications. Can you hear me?
Артемий, are you still here?
I'm typing. I'm typing.
Ah, okay, okay, you are typing. Okay, good. Uh-huh. Is this a question for whom?
For Michael and Ben.
Mhm. Okay, what are the political implications of naturalism? Can we have a natural politics? This is a question for Michael and Ben, and maybe for all of us to think. This is one of the main questions for the whole issue.
I mean, I can give a quick response, if that's okay, Michael. So basically, the point that I try to make in my article, Ferraris has this line. Oh, so sorry, real quick, briefly. Ferraris divides basically reality into two different ontological realms, right? There's this unamenable realm of the real that he calls, which is essentially, you know, the reality independent of human conceptual schemes and all of this kind of stuff. And then he has, related back to his earlier work on documentality, this idea of social reality. So he divides in this way, right? Social reality and natural reality. And you know, you can read this almost like a Spinozist division between attributes or something like that. And so the brief point that I try to make in my article about the sort of political implications of this theory is that any kind of emancipation there, and he makes this claim, would happen within social reality. And the argument that I want to make there is, if you are implying that social reality is somehow less real, or its you know, ontological import is subservient to this kind of unamenable real, right? That we only have this sort of inscrutable, passive, non-conceptual access to, then any kind of emancipation or any kind of motion or progress, whatever, however we want to put it, that might be made in social reality is not in the same, it's not real in the same way, right? So I want to say something along the lines that if we do have this strict demarcation between social reality and then again, like what we might call natural reality or something else, that right, any kind of emancipation that takes place there, you know, it's this kind of illusory sort of thing, right? We have to be able to really grapple with our very notion of where sort of authority and constraint come from, not just in the sort of social sense, right, but in this robust real sense. So that's kind of the point that I try to make in my article. So that would be kind of my quick response there.
Yes, so I could probably give several responses, mutually complementary responses to this question of the political implications of naturalism, because after all, aside from this project on geophilosophy, specifically for Stasis, I have been working on the political implications of plant philosophy. I have this book on pyropolitics, or the role of fire in political practice theory, and so on. But I see these phenomena, or these things that are usually associated with a certain naturalism from a slightly different perspective. I mean, if I were in my Heideggerian mood, I would say that there is nothing natural about naturalism. The essence of naturalism is nothing natural. And to return to these lived realities, or to these phenomena of fire, plants, the earth, even dust, is to go to something that really both pre-exists and survives the realm of what is very narrowly defined as naturalism. So in this particular essay I wrote for Stasis, the reference to the self-consciousness of the earth already gestures beyond a naturalism that would allow the earth only a very different kind of relatedness or relationality than that of self-consciousness, for instance. So I would rather maybe think about matter and materiality, but not naturalism in the sense in which it even bases itself on the notion of nature as a conjunction of all the things in the world without the awareness of the Greek prehistory of the term, of physis, which was not as static as that, which really referred to a kind of overall emergence, burgeoning, and growth of all that is. So maybe if you want to restate this naturalism as a kind of physicalism, not physicalism, but physicalism, recovering a certain dimension of what Greeks called nature, I would be maybe more comfortable with that, but not with naturalism within these very narrow confines, first of Natura and then of the ism that is attached to it in the philosophical tradition.
There was a question for, another comment from Артемий. Hegel says spirit leaves nature alone. Same should be done to politics. Same meaning spirit has to leave politics alone, or politics has to leave nature alone. This I didn't understand. Freedom to all, it says. Let the people go.
Well, if anything, for Hegel, I think politics would be the highest expression of spirit, really. Spirit's absolute self-awareness, really, would be the political realm. So I'm not following maybe.
We have another question from Mikhail Fedorchenko.
Yeah. Thank you kindly for your speeches. I would like to ask you a question regarding post-capitalism intentionality of nature and the whole geophilosophical realm of these relations between technological and biological. And this is a question for both of the remaining lecturers. So in a sense, what we call nature or biological can also be related to the way how we perceive the technological advances and the implementation in the naturalistic things as a continuation of the nature. But regarding the post-Stiglerian studies and these types of de-anthropomorphization of technology and nature, how can this mediation and can be reproduced and to the point that we can call this relation and this not by anthropomorphical relation between the nature, technological, and capitalism to be truly post-capitalist? What general rules of this divide can be avoided for us to make a truly different post-capitalistic politics about nature?
Well, maybe I'll jump into this very quickly because and approach this from the standpoint of plant philosophy or vegetal philosophy more than the philosophy of the earth in a sense. even though the philosophy of the earth is also relevant here, I think the most recent tendency has been to attribute subjectivity to entities and beings who were not considered subjects before. And that includes not only plants, for instance, but whole ecosystems. So especially from the standpoint of legal protections, from the standpoint of the law, in New Zealand, there is a river basin that is considered to be a legal subject now, to be protected from exploitation and so on. And it would seem that one of the tendencies of post-capitalism that you are pointing at moves in this direction of subjectification, of attributing subjectivity to entities that were not considered subjects before. But I am very concerned about this because, of course, we have to ask from the standpoint of capitalism and the extraction of value, where is the value really, all the sort of surplus value and exploitation, where is it coming from now? It's coming from the exploitation of subjectivity, right? Knowledge economies is a kind of name for that. So to attribute a subjective status is not, in fact, a panacea from capitalist exploitation. If anything, it might enlarge the scope and the circle of capitalist exploitation if that exploitation is really kind of concentrating on procuring value from subjects. Then the broader the sphere of subjects, the more value can be procured. Now plants are subjects, ecosystems are subjects, and so that gives them almost an unlimited scope to further exploitation. So that's the concern.
We have two more questions in chat. One from Evgeny Konoplев. In continue, or Evgeny, do you want to talk?
Yes. Good evening, all. In continue of previous question of Артемий Магун, what are possible applications of naturalist philosophy in natural and social sciences?
So I'll take a quick stab at some of that. I think that at least when we sort of reach back into the history of philosophy to look at the way that, in my case, Schelling, and it sounds like in other cases, Hegel, the way that they actually think about nature in a quite distinct fashion from the way that we do, I would say that it's almost kind of an ungrounding function, right? Maybe what these kind of studies can do is, instead of reify our understanding of nature as it kind of manifests in the natural and social sciences, it would allow us to kind of reconceptualize a framework or a new sort of naturalism that wouldn't sort of fall prey to these kind of particularly the early 20th century, a lot of the stuff that Heidegger writes about, right, which Schelling was also concerned with too, right, this idea of the subjectification or, the enframing of nature and stuff like that. So maybe one of the best things is not so much providing a new model of nature, but, unnaturalizing our sort of current contemporary notion of nature as it applies in those figures. So it's almost like a negative answer, right? It can help us by denaturalizing nature such that we have a better understanding of what the natural and social sciences might look like without this kind of contemporary inherited concept of nature, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Anyone else wants to reply to this very important question?
Well, I think that I've spoken too much maybe, but I have a very concrete response to this because I have an experience of working with natural scientists, that is plant scientists actually. And so this is maybe not a model, but one of you're asking about applications. This is a concrete application that happened. There is a group of very embattled plant scientists who do experimental research with plants, but who are proponents of plant intelligence. So they argue, unlike their more traditionally minded colleagues, that plants are not just stupid kind of organic beings, but that they have an intelligence of their own, a way of relating to the world. And they are usually mocked by the traditional plant scientists who say, your experimental design is fine, but your interpretation of the results and your conclusions don't really, they're completely absurd. And so they have realized that this group of heterodox scientists has realized that they have no training in interpreting these issues of language, subjectivity, relation to the world, and so on. And they need philosophers actually for this. So since I have been working on plant philosophy, they asked me, they also asked the person from the more analytic side of things as well, who is helping this group. They asked me, please give us a framework, a kind of a solid theoretical framework to think about the intelligence of plants and to put the results of our empirical studies onto. And so I wrote a couple of articles for this plant biology journal, which is very difficult because it's a different style of argumentation, referencing, and everything else. But I wrote one article on the phenomenological framework of a plant's relation to the world, kind of imagining how the phenomenology of plants, the world from the perspective of plants would look like. And another more specific article on the notion of plant attention, vegetal attention, and this kind of presumably higher cognitive function of paying attention, how it might work in the case of a sessile being, a being tethered by its roots to the place where it is. And so this is just an example. We had kind of a very good interaction with this group of scientists. And I think that they are now using at least bits and pieces of this framework that I tried to put in very simple terms to interpret their experimental research data.
If I may, I can also, in order to support Michael's position, but from a slightly different point of view, from the animal part of natural philosophical approaches, I would refer to our students who is maybe here, maybe not. Her name is Zoya Komarova. And yesterday she told us about wonderful discoveries in contemporary biology with regards to the animal's behavior and the way to reconsider it reconsider it today. So contemporary biology, at least some avant-garde scientists within these disciplines claim that animals are not that determined being deprived of free choice, unable to love and to have friendship, to make choice, so deprived of free will and consciousness, etc., of reasoning. They actually do. They got everything. They got their traditions, their folklore, their reasonings, their ways of making alliances and communications that are different from a mere stupid following their natural instincts, as many scientists thought previously. But what we learn from the history of science is that natural sciences and social sciences as well are determined. They are themselves determined as those animals in previous way of thinking, but not by instincts, but the instinct of the natural science or its natural limitation is the worldview of their age, actually. And now what is an ongoing process in animal and plant sciences is already an abandoning or a critique or reconsidering of the Darwinist tradition that was very much contemporary to the capitalist society and emerges together with its race. So what philosophy does actually, or natural philosophy here, it is not only a child of its own time, and but it also questions the worldview. It breaks these limits, and in this sense, collaboration between philosophers and scientists brings to really brings to new results. It is a transgression of a certain limits. Yes. No. Okay. There is a Hegel speaks of the instinct of reason. Yes, he speaks in the chapter 5 again, where he also criticizes the so-called observant reason, which is a positivist, which is actually a positivist science. Yes, and I saw some other question. From Andrei. Andrei Denisov. A question for all speakers. Will nature have rights if it does become a subject? The current laws speak of nature more like someone else's property. Anyone?
Well, from what I'm familiar with, actually, this is the goal in extending subjecthood, subject status to nature. The goal is to give ecosystems or particular natural beings the rights that subjects have. The question is, and of course, it might follow to the extreme, the traditional liberal narrative of expanding the circle of subjecthood to include more and more beings. First, types of human beings who were not included before, then certain non-human beings who are organic still, and then even inorganic beings like mountains or rivers and so on. And in that sense, we can certainly criticize this trend. But in another sense, I think that this extension cannot go on indefinitely, because it questions the very center that is being extended out onto the margins. Because this idea of subject protection under the law really is a protection of the subject who is capable of appropriation. It's always a subject with property. And if beings who were previously considered to be property are now becoming subjects, then we have to ask, what is property? This basic question that is just constantly presumed, right? If we're questioning the being of a subject who can appropriate, we have to question the meaning of property philosophically. And it's not enough, as Marx did, to question the distinction between private and collective property. Before that distinction, the very notion of property has to be questioned. And I think, for me at least, this is the promising direction that this kind of extension of subjecthood and therefore rights to nature, as it were, have.
Yeah, it would seem to imply also a rethinking of the notion of rights, or the subjective's rights, as one who asserts themselves or attempts to claim those rights, right? What does it mean to give a right? Can a right be received? So I think the question there about if nature becoming subject, that might need to be reworked a little bit, right? What would it even mean for nature to become a subject? What would it mean to see within nature this process of asserting oneself or claiming a right for oneself? Right, because there's a rich discourse about the idea that rights can never be given. One can never give a right to another. So I think that might come into this conversation in a complicated way too.
Thanks a lot to both of you.
Артемий comments that Bibihin wrote a book on property. True. And I would like to add that there is another tendency in contemporary debates and in contemporary philosophy to not to acquire a subject status to all the non-human things, but to deprive human beings from the status of the subject, to just to refuse the subjectivity at all in general, and this is interesting. It is as if we were witnessing the process opposite. The process opposite to what Hegel already mentioned here several times, called substance becoming subject. We are now in some different, are captured within some different processes of subject becoming something else, and something like agencies with their distributed responsibilities for what is happening right now, or objects like an object-oriented ontology, agencies like in actor network theory and other new materialisms. Just to think about the critique of Vadim's critique of flat ontologies and their political, socio-political aspects, we have to refer to Marx's theory of reification, of becoming things of the subjects, and maybe object-oriented philosophy or other contemporary philosophical schools, they just feel this tendency, and they are trying to find the proper definitions for it. This is a question to think about. I suggest. There is something in the. Okay. Thank you. Other comments? Questions? Okay, I see that probably we actually have an interesting. Okay, there is a remark from Yulia. A small one. Sorry, from Yulia. We cannot hear you. Oh, okay. Maybe. Can you hear? Can. Mm-hmm. Then you can write it on the chat if something doesn't work. Okay, while Julie is writing, we read another question from Roman Asminkin. Maybe, yeah, do we still have translators? Yeah, maybe it's better if, yeah, if they will translate. Or I can. Mm-hmm. Great question, Roman. Yes, anyone?
Well, I mean, I guess real quickly, one of the things that perhaps folks involved in the climate justice movement would emphasize is that, maybe it's not an either or, right? Sort of striving for particular realms of subjective emancipation doesn't necessarily exclude, right, the further emancipation of those that, natural non-subjects or whatever kind of language we want to use there. It could be helpful to think about it in terms of a more holistic approach to receiving rights, justice, however we want to frame the political conversation there.
Yes, absolutely, Benjamin. And just to add to this, one could also say that the root of the oppression might be the same, regardless of the effects that it unleashes onto different kinds of beings. So very often, again, it's posited as an either or choice for emancipating this or that group, but we can recognize that capitalist exploitation has the same detrimental effect on farmers in Vietnam, on the mass-produced plants that are being grown there without being capable of reproducing by themselves, right, with these sterile, genetically modified seeds. So if you start looking at the causes behind the oppression of human and non-human beings and the devastation of the ecosystems themselves, the causes are going to be very much the same. Yeah.
Thank you. I think the same. I'm totally agree with Michael on this. And we have a question already from Gyula. Objectification of subjects and subjectification of nature poses the question of property and perhaps also the question of what is becoming of democracy. I'm thinking of Hobbes and the invention of the political subject as a person with rights. No human subject, still possible democracy? Question mark. An interesting question. Well, there is a book on the democracy of objects, for instance, by Paul Levi-Bryant. So I guess actually democracy should be democracy by definition, democracy for everyone. Objects, subjects, agencies, animals, humans, plants, mountains, everyone is welcome. Also non-subjects. That's what I would suggest for a kind of true democracy. If you don't want to be a subject, you prefer to be object, fine, you have your object rights. Well, I'm a little bit kidding, but maybe why not?
I think that actually Hannah Arendt has made a very good, very substantial contribution to this question, because she does not define the political subject as a person with rights. What she's focusing on is the right to have rights. And by taking away this personal substratum, this ontological substratum, and talking about the right to have rights, she potentially opens it up to non-human beings, because it doesn't specify whether it's a person or an animal or a plant or whatever. Of course, Arendt herself did not really follow up on this kind of more radical implication of her thinking, but in retrospect, it's clear that she's going a step further than this invention of the political subject as a person with rights quoted here in the comment.
Yeah, and just real quickly, I think that thinking about things that what are the conditions for the possibility of even having rights can point us back to the importance of some of the work that Hegel and Schelling do to undermine the sort of absolutization of the dichotomy between subjects and objects, right? So if our conversation here is there democracy without subjects, right? Are we all objects? What is the subject-object division? All of this kind of stuff. Some of those worries can be sort of cast aside, or at least pushed aside a little bit, if we no longer take the subject-object dualism to be absolute, right? Or if we no longer understand things like the categories of subject and object themselves to be sufficient to completely explain, right, our relationship to the world. There's a scholar, I can't remember his name right now, and it's really driving me insane, but he does some work on the intellectual history of the American pragmatists in relationship to Hegel. And one of the things that he's suggested is that in certain American pragmatists, the notion of subject and object has actually been transposed into the notion of organism and environment, right? And this might be a more sort of holistic way to think about the permeability between subjects and objects and these kind of things, so that we no longer get saddled with these somewhat weird philosophical questions of what does it mean for a subject to become an object and this kind of thing, right? We're able to think about the relationship there and a lot of the sort of dynamic that's articulated by some of these post-Kantian German idealists in this kind of more familiar language that I think connects back to some of the responses that were given to the previous question, right? About the fact that, you know, subjective liberation is not necessarily something that happens apart from objective liberation when we begin thinking about things in terms of organisms and environments, right? And this sort of more general, what one might call ecological form of thinking. So that's kind of a response that I would have there.
There is a discussion already in the comments, but let's say we are slightly coming to an end of this of our very inspiring discussion, because we have certain limitations in time. I will read, however, a comment from Eugene Konoplев again. Concept of democracy of objects has some problem. How to calculate the ballots in the voting, especially for non-speaking multitudes of objects, which is a good question. And Giulia's comments, what about what Oksana said, reification of the human? Yes. What about what Michael said, subjectivation of nature, cannibalization of it? Better put, human cannibalization of it. Well, should we? Does anyone have comments on this? On these comments? Comments on the comments? If not, actually, I have to say that we a little bit exceeded already certain, the timing of our translators, to whom we are endlessly thankful for actually a wonderful job they did this evening. And I also have to thank everyone who participated, who gave talks, and who was here with us. Artemi, do you want to say something? I see your hand. Or maybe he doesn't. Well, or yes, for wonderful presentations.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. He's saying thank you so much, everyone. So, anyone wants to say a final word or something to summarize? So we see that we touched so many questions that we must do the second issue of this, the second volume of this issue. Please do submit your papers who didn't yet. The deadline is February 15. Join our program next year, and oh my God, 8 comments. So when the issue is coming out in the summer. So have a good night, and thank you everyone. Bye bye.